All right, in chapter 10, we are now talking about how we are going to make agriculture sustainable. That way we can continue to feed our growing population. Um, so, the industrialization of agriculture has boosted worldwide production of food and fiber and also has brought increased pollution and resource depletion. I'm sure that you could have figured that out. So basically, our ability to produce food has increased more than our global population up to this point. We devote a ton more fossil fuels. We are using more irrigation, fertilizers, and pesticides. We are planting and harvesting more frequently. We're cultivating more acreage of land, and we've developed more crop and livestock varieties using genetically modified organisms as well as artificial selection. And I'm sure that you would have known that all of those things I just listed are not great for the sustainability because they are leading to things like soil degradation and things like that. So, while we must be proud of our increase in food quality and the quality of life it's brought for people, which we're going to talk about this lesson, we have to work to find a way to make it more sustainable. So if you take a look at this graph, we can see that, not related to the graph. So one thing that people are talking about is organic farming, which decreases the efficiency. It's on a much smaller scale, but organic farming, because it's going to use less technology, less fossil fuels, and less pesticides and things like that, will have far fewer environmental impacts. So this graph is showing from 1961 to currently. This is the world population as it's grown, and relative to the 1961. That's why it's not sloping up, because it's showing the rate. But basically it's showing our levels relative to then. So our roots and tubers, that's like potatoes and potato related things, are still growing slowly, but close to human population. Grains has increased a ton, fruits has increased a ton, vegetables has increased a ton. So we are producing a lot of food right now. But while we are producing all this food, we are actually there's still several different types of food problems facing the world. So undernutrition, overnutrition, and malnutrition. So despite the fact that we have really improved food production, we're making better food and more of it, 80 million people on the planet suffer from undernutrition, meaning they're not getting enough calories in their day. Your book says that every 5 seconds, a child somewhere on the planet dies of starvation, which is terrible. And this has a lot to do with poverty. So 1 out of every 7 people on the planet lives on less than $1.25 a day. And that number increases to 1/3 of the world lives on less than $2 a day. If you think about how much a Starbucks costs, and that's just one coffee, obviously the US is living, we're over consuming compared to a lot of the planet's average. So most people who are undernourished, meaning they're hungry, not getting enough food, live in developing countries, but it's thought that 49 million people are classified as what's called food insecure, and that's in the US. So 49 million people in the US are food insecure, and food security is defined as the guarantee of an adequate, safe, nutritious, and reliable food supply. So maybe people are getting food every day, but they don't know where it's going to come from, or maybe it's McDonald's 3 times a day, because that's all they can afford, because fast food is usually really cheap. So that would be food insecure. So undernutrition is obviously a big problem. The number of people suffering from food insecurity has decreased a lot since the 1960s. So here we're looking at, this graph is only since 1990, but it's showing the percentage of people that are undernourished and the number of people. So it is decreasing. Then we also have something called overnutrition, which is where someone is receiving too many calories in a day. And this is much more common, as you might guess, in developed countries, and developing countries, due to the abundance of cheap junk food. How much cheaper is it to get a fast food meal than it is to get a healthy meal somewhere else full of vitamins and proteins? Hot Cheetos are pretty cheap. And also sedentary lifestyles. Even if you think that even a person you wouldn't think of as being sedentary, meaning you stay in one spot all day, office jobs put you in a chair and you stay there all day. And that's what it's like a lot in America. So it's really, if you're a busy person, you eat cheap junk food all day and you sit in your office chair, and it leads to overnutrition. And this excess weight leads to heart disease, diabetes, stroke, some forms of cancer, and other health issues. So you know that being overweight is not healthy for you. The statistics for the US are kind of crazy. 1 out of every 3 adults in the US is classified as obese. This is we're by far the leading country in obesity. But worldwide, about 1/3, a little over 1/3 of adults are classified as overweight. Overweight is less than obese. And of the overweight adults, 1/3 of them is classified as obese. So while it's 1/3 of the adults in the US, so 33%. So 33% of adults in the US are overweight. 39%, are obese. 39% of adults in the world are overweight, and 1/3 of that is obese. So that would be about 13% of the world's adults. So a lot more of us are obese in the US. Then there's also something called malnutrition, which is a shortage of specific nutrients. So it's not a shortage of calories. Maybe you are eating enough every day that you don't feel hungry because there's food in your stomach, but you're not getting the right kind of food that your body needs to be healthy. And so this is, you've probably seen this, one specific kind of malnutrition is what's called kwashiorkor. And this is people who don't get enough, who have too much starch and not enough protein in their diets. So this would be people who are eating mostly rice because it's cheap in developing nations, and this leads to bloating of the abdomen. So if you've ever seen images of starving children in Africa that have those huge bellies, those cute little kids, it's probably due to a lack of protein. It can also lead to deterioration of the hair, mental disabilities, and other issues. So it's really a problem if your body isn't able to do the normal things that it needs to survive based on the food that you're putting into it. There's also another kind of deficiency called marasmus, which is a just complete protein deficiency as well as a loss of calories. Then there's also a deficiency of iron, which leads to anemia, which actually is very lots of adults in the US are anemic just because they're not getting enough iron in their food. So you can think that you're eating completely healthy and be suffering from some sort of malnutrition. All right, so then let's talk about the Green Revolution. So the Green Revolution was a movement that introduced new technologies, crop varieties, and farming practices to the developing world. So the agricultural scientists realized that we couldn't go on forever just making additional farmland. As we needed more food, we couldn't just keep expanding our farms to create more food. We needed to find a way to make more food from the land that we had, because we were obviously eventually going to run out of land. And so this started in the 1940s when this guy named Norman Borlaug taught Mexico's farmers how to plant this strain of wheat. Sorry if this is covering the text. It was a strain of wheat that was high yielding, meaning it produced a lot of wheat from the plant itself. It was disease resistant, so it no yields would be wiped out from disease. And so Mexico, from growing this particular strain of wheat, was able to triple its wheat production. And within 2 decades, it's tripled its wheat production and started to export wheat, which is crazy. So then this guy, Norman Borlaug, actually won the Nobel Peace Prize. And then he also took his wheat to India and Pakistan and transformed their agriculture as well. So Norman Borlaug is actually credited as saving more lives than anyone in history. So it's pretty cool. That's him right there. So while this industrialized agriculture has been able to bring much more food to developing nations, it's also brought the use of synthetic fertilizers, which can lead to nutrient pollution. It's brought more pesticides, which we're going to talk about this chapter and why that's negative. Intensive irrigation, which we talked about, can lead to soil degradation and loss of fertility and loss of biodiversity, and also lots of fossil fuel powered machinery. So while it's obviously a positive that now we're feeding people and that these nations are able to feed themselves, it is causing a very big environmental problem. So it allowed India to, same thing as Mexico, transform from a country with very high rates of starvation to a country that was able to export grains. And that was the Green Revolution. So while the Green Revolution helped increase per person food production by 8%, by 48%. So we are now increasing our food production a ton. It only increased land use by 11%. So it really helped preserve biodiversity because now we are not cutting down rainforests. We are not destroying as many habitats to farm. Instead, we're making more food from the land that we're farming. But it has, on the flip side, it has, because of the intensive use of fertilizers and pesticides, it has really worsened pollution, it has worsened erosion and water and air quality. So this comes back to the other inconvenient truth that agriculture has had a much bigger mark on our environment than we would have thought. These graphs are showing the production of grain and how it has improved tremendously, and also how these imports have turned to exports. I don't know what country it's in though. So at first it was all grain imports, and now it's, oh, India. They were importing all this grain, and now by the year 2010 they are able to export it. So it's done a lot. Oh, another environmental impact is that in conventional agriculture, so these days we plant our crops in monocultures, which we've talked about, meaning that there's going to be huge farmlands with one crop. It's easier to maintain. It requires less input from farmers because you're doing the same practice everywhere. But the problem is that it increases efficiency, but it also reduces biodiversity because the animals that may have lived on that land before, if you only plant one crop, may not be able to be a habitat to as quite an array of organisms, whether that be small mammals or bugs or bacteria or whatever it might be. It also, monocultures are more susceptible to disease and insect pests than are if you do a traditional agriculture with many crops. So there's all these positives, but there are a lot of negatives on the environment because of our industrialized agriculture. So the question is, how can we achieve sustainable agriculture? In sustainable agriculture, you probably could have guessed the definition. It means farming and grazing, so we're cropland and rangeland we're talking, that maintains healthy soil, so there's no soil degradation, clean water, we're not polluting the water, we're protecting our pollinators, we're protecting genetic diversity and other resources that we're going to need to be able to feed ourselves in 100, 200, 300 years. So the reduction of fossil fuels and pollution are seen as the key goals in the movement of sustainable agriculture. So some possible solutions include increase in organic farming. That would lead to a lot less pollution because we're not putting as many chemicals onto our crops, as well as improved technologies that will use less fossil fuels and increase efficiency, and greater use of genetically modified crops. So this is what we're looking forward to in terms of sustainable agriculture.